afternoon, everybody. I'm even more, obviously, not Baroness Taylor. As Ruth mentioned, I'm Murray Hunt, Director of the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law. I'm your substitute chair for the second panel. I'm going to let you into a little secret about why I'm your substitute chair. In 2018, at the height of the tussles between Parliament and the Executive over Brexit, I asked Ruth to step in and do the chairing gig from hell by chairing none other than the then Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow, at the Bingham Centre annual lecture, talking about the role of Parliament in relation to Brexit, which I think Ruth's never forgiven me for. At the end of the event, which of course she did a fantastic job with her usual calm, cool, authoritative air, at the end I said to her, please do call in the favour sometime. So here we are. When I got the phone call this morning, I couldn't possibly say no. I'm actually delighted to be here to discuss this very overdue review in my view. My experience has been shaped very much by having been the legal advisor to the Joint Committee on Human Rights in the UK Parliament for a number of years. And that committee actually, as Paul Evans also well knows, embodies in a way the lack of fitness for purpose of our systems for scrutinising delegated legislation. Because on the one hand, the JCHR does turbocharged super scrutiny of a particular type of statutory instrument, a remedial order. And that's all well and good when it's a derogation from the right to liberty in terrorism legislation, for example. But when it's about the right to marry your mother-in-law, as one of those remedial orders was, it receives the same degree of intense scrutiny from the JCHR, which is something of a mismatch, let's say. But it's also the case that the JCHR doesn't scrutinise almost any of the statutory instruments which have often quite serious human rights implications. So the expert committee in the UK Parliament, with the human rights expertise at its disposal in its secretariat and its members, doesn't look at statutory instruments for human rights compatibility, which is obviously a fairly extraordinary shortcoming in our scrutiny arrangements. So I think this is a fantastic opportunity, this review. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. We're going to be hearing from three distinguished and very experienced parliamentarians from both houses, who I'll introduce in due course. But first of all, I'm going to hand over to Ruth and Tom from the Hansard Society to introduce the review.
Thank you, Murray, and thank you for stepping into the breach and reminding the audience, for any of you who were there back in 2018, of what was not, shall we say, my finest hour. Chairing the Speaker of the House of Commons, who didn't really have an awful lot of, shall we say, respect for the chair at the time. So it was a slightly awkward event. Right, so I'm just going to set out at the beginning a little bit about the background to the review, why we're here, why the Hansard Society is undertaking this exercise. Of course, we've all talked, and we heard a lot about it on the first panel, that delegated legislation has obviously been thrust into the spotlight by Brexit and COVID. But actually, we need to step back from that and not get too drawn into what have been very unusual events, because, in fact, the issues with delegated legislation are long-standing and deep-rooted. In fact, you can go back 90 years. In 1932, the report of the Donoughmore Committee on Ministers' Powers. For those of you who are the real anoraks in the room will know what that was about. It was a committee which was established because of growing disenchantment with the parliamentary safeguards that governed the delegation of power to ministers. Sounds familiar. And that report stressed the inevitability of the practice of delegated legislation, which I think we all accept, but acknowledged that the system was open to abuse. It attacked what it called the abandonment by Parliament of its legislative functions. It said there is at present no effective machinery for parliamentary control. It denounced the haphazard system of delegated legislation without plan or logic, and implicitly it laid much of the responsibility for this at the feet of parliamentarians themselves. Now, a few of that committee's recommendations in 1932 were since implemented, and in fact, in practice, little has changed. We've got parliamentary report upon parliamentary report upon parliamentary report from the procedure committees of both houses to little avail. The House of Lords has been ahead of the game compared to the House of Commons. It set up its own scrutiny committees for both powers, look at powers in bills through the Delegated Powers Committee and the policy merits through the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee. But in the Commons, there's been no comparable reform until we had the European Union Statutory Instruments Committee a few years ago for the Brexit instruments. So we don't underestimate the difficulties of making progress on this issue of bringing about reform. No government likes to give up power, no government likes scrutiny, and it's an inconvenience. But scrutiny and accountability is essential to parliamentary governance. And I would say we can't afford to get to the 100th anniversary in a decade's time of the Donoughmore Committee and nothing have changed. But one of the things I'd be interested in finding out, both from our panellists, but also from all of you and from the politicians we'll be engaging with during the course of the review, is exactly how we can make some progress, given those political realities. How can we engage, particularly MPs, more in this subject? Now, I think in terms of the timing, obviously Brexit and COVID does partly dictate the timing for this review. And I don't think from the government's perspective that they can take it for granted that we will continue to have the kind of, if you like, public and parliamentary acceptance of the system that we've had in recent years. We've certainly seen during COVID that confidence in the system has been stretched arguably close to breaking point. So I'd argue it's in this government's and indeed future government's interest to have an open mind about reform. We've also heard on the first panel about the volume of statutory instruments. It's been a challenge to manage for government departments. Looking ahead, Lord Frost's review of retained EU law with a tailored mechanism for accelerating the repeal or amendment of this law. Well, we wait to see what it means, but combined with the significant changes we're expecting to the regulatory landscape, it's likely to mean a lot more statutory instruments. So for parliamentarians, there are more resource challenges ahead. How are they going to scrutinise new, highly technical policy areas like artificial intelligence, drones, digital tech, gene editing, without access to more expert support, issues which are all going to find their way into statutory instruments in the future. We've talked about in the first panel the comparable resourcing of legislative committees, process compared to the select committees for policy and for scrutiny of finances. Resources in Whitehall and Westminster are going to continue to come under ever more pressure. So I think there are some very practical reasons and practical advantages to having a discussion about the future of delegated legislation. It's not just about the political and the constitutional and the legal reasons. It's also about very practical matters in terms of governance. Why the Hansard Society? Well, I mentioned at the start of today the Society's been working on this issue for a decade. Our report, published in 2014, was the first extensive study of the subject for a very long time. But I think we can bring our long record for impartiality, our role as Westminster's critical friend, to this to provide a platform for discussion of these difficult issues. We also have our unique resource, the Statutory Instrument Tracker, which we update in real time daily and which underpins all our research and analysis. This is the tracker. If you haven't seen it during the break, my colleague Dean Manth can give you a demo at the end of today's session. That tracker data is what we use throughout the pandemic to track the coronavirus statutory instruments, which I know, a dashboard that I know many of you found useful. So bringing all of this to the table, we think we can help galvanise the case for reform, coordinate and work in partnership with other organisations. The core problems are fairly clear. Powers in bills are frequently too broad. The scrutiny process, particularly in the Commons, is inadequate and often wastes the valuable time of MPs. Parliamentarians can't hold ministers to account for their decisions. They can't exercise influence. There's a question about amendability, the quality of explanatory material. And the system is now, I think, so complex in some respects that both civil servants and parliamentarians struggle to understand aspects of it. And actually, that's where important mistakes are being made, the kinds of mistakes that we see during our tracker week in, week out. So we think root and branch reform is needed. We've got an open mind about what that will look like. But I'm going to hand over to Tom to tell you a little bit about the practicalities of how we're going to do it.
Thank you, Ruth, and I just want to echo how great it is to see everyone here today. More anoraks than on the coat rack. Great to have us all in one place. So I joined the Society recently to work specifically on this new project which we're launching today, the review of delegated legislation. Now, the idea behind this is to build on the Society's existing work, outlining the problems with delegated legislation, and to look ahead to review and assess what better might look like. We want to think about, and we want to get others thinking about, how you might design a system if you had a blank piece of paper. So the project, which is supported by funding from the Legal Education Foundation, will run throughout the course of next year to develop these proposals, by the end of which we will have put together some concrete proposals for reform. That will include ideas for what a new Statutory Instruments Act could look like. As we've heard, the existing Act is from 1946, over 75 years old, and as well as potential changes to standing orders, our mind is open as to what will be needed. We don't have all the answers ourselves, we do know that, which is why, as well as relying on our own research, both current and new, we'll be seeking views and input from others. So to everyone in the room here today, we want to hear from you. We want to hear from those inside government and inside Parliament about the practical barriers that you'd like to see removed. We want to hear from former insiders, from academic experts, about the conceptual issues which the review must address. We want to hear from politicians, from journalists, from civil society, about what issues matter most to people and their representatives. So over the coming year, we're going to be hosting events to examine these issues more closely. We hope these will be a chance to curate and incubate our ideas. They will cover all manner of issues, from conditional amendment to Keeling schedules, from appropriate constitutional balance of powers to how SIs are best categorised or indeed named. Do please come along. We'll also be producing written outputs and seeking written feedback on those. For example, we'll be producing materials on the delegated powers in bills, in particular where those bills are introduced into the Commons, and so MPs do not have the benefit of DPRRC reports. We'll be looking at the efficacy of strengthened scrutiny procedures, at how scrutiny in an emergency ought to operate, and seeing what lessons can be learned from other legislatures, including in the devolved nations. One key component of our convening of expert conversation will be an expert advisory panel that we have set up to support this work. As you can see, we've got a truly excellent range of top cross-party politicians and leading constitutional experts who've kindly agreed to meet regularly to inject their expertise and their perspectives into the review and to road test these emerging ideas. So thank you. I know some of you here today. We're very much looking forward to working with you. Now, before I get down and hand over to the main event, I just want to give a taster of what we see as the agenda for reform. We don't have all the answers, but we do have some outline principles for what better might look like. So we think scrutiny needs to be focused so that parliamentarians can spend their time on what matters to them and not have it wasted attending frequently inefficient and ineffective committees. Scrutiny needs to be tailored, based on the actual content of the law and the current context, decided on by today's politicians, not the Parliament of yesteryear. Scrutiny must be better resourced. We've already heard about this, in particular bearing in mind the increased technical nature of law that we're seeing. It must be transparent, its terminology simplified to help modernise it and make it more accessible to the public. And then finally on the right, you'll see some questions which we will be tussling with over the coming months. Questions we've already started to engage with today. Where should the line be between primary and secondary legislation? How can reform help government deliver its SI programme? Could reform even facilitate more law being made through an improved delegated legislation process? Well, with those questions, I hope whetting your appetite for what we have ahead. I'll hand back over to Murray and invite the speakers. So please, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ruth and Tom. It is, I think, I don't think you have to be an anorak to find this quite an exciting moment. I think it's a shame it's taken a pandemic, but I think the pandemic has undoubtedly created this opportunity. It is definitely the case that delegated legislation has broken through to consciousness in the media, probably more widely amongst the public, and it's also revealed a lot of cross-party consensus we saw on the first panel about some of the basics. So I'm very, very excited about the review that we're going to be conducting. So thank you very much for giving us a taste of that. So we're now going to move on to our keynote speaker, who needs no introduction from me, Mr. Steve Baker, MP, Member of Parliament for Wickham since 2010. Steve, as you all know, was a Brexit minister and has the distinction, I won't use an adjective, of signing the first SI under the EU Withdrawal Act, which he took through Parliament. And he has also, with Mark, been a very active voice in Parliament, raising some quite awkward rule of law questions about delegated legislation in relation to the pandemic. So, Steve, we're delighted to
Thank you, Murray.
invite you to take the podium.
My lords, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for being here this evening. It's a genuine privilege to address such an august audience, and of course it's the sort of thing politicians always say, but this evening I can tell you I really mean it, and I see people like Sir Jonathan in the audience with whom I worked as a Brexit minister, and I shall say thank you properly later in my remarks. I want to take you on something of a journey through my 11 years in Parliament, because I still vividly remember that on Tuesday, the 6th of July 2010, I walked into my first ever Delegated Legislation Committee to scrutinise the first piece of such legislation in my modest parliamentary career. It was the draft Conduct of Employment Agencies and Employment Businesses Amendment Regulations 2010. Now, I walked into the committee room and my eye was drawn to a solitary figure in the public gallery at the back. And I made a conversation with him, and it turned out his daughter had been exploited by a modelling agency. So he was now campaigning for a change in the law to protect other fathers' daughters from what his own daughter had suffered at the hands of unscrupulous people. These regulations were supposed to protect potentially vulnerable people seeking work by tightening the restrictions on the charging of upfront fees in the entertainment and modelling sectors. Registering a portfolio with an agency cost a fee, but agencies would frequently say that the portfolio was not good enough. Of course, they would say it was not good enough and would have to be redone, for which they'd charge huge sums, perhaps running to £1,000. The regulations were supposed to prevent this. But it won't work, he said to me, as I remember it, because it doesn't cover movies. All the agencies will do is say that they've got to have a portfolio fit for movies, so they'll just carry on ripping off young women. The committee began, the minister spoke for 12 minutes, his opposition counterpart for 4 minutes, and then back to the minister to wrap up. It was all over in just 19 minutes. 15 other MPs, many of them also newly elected like me, and on their first legislative committee, sat in that debate just like me, knowing very little about the substance that we were scrutinising, but knowing full well that the last thing that the whips wanted was for one of us to stand up and speak. Now, I don't know whether the father's concerns that the regulation was unworkable were well-founded, but his concerns seemed perfectly reasonable, and it was not addressed in the debate. And I'd like to confess my own failing here. In this, my first committee, I didn't have the confidence to raise this issue. Of course, if it happened tomorrow, I would raise it immediately in the committee, but it shouldn't be dependent on the confidence of an individual MP and the capacity of that MP to engage in conversation with someone who happened to be in the public gallery. But I digress. Certainly today I would pick it up. So I thought at the time, and I blogged on my website, that the whole experience was unedifying. Goodness knows what that father thought, and I tell this story to convey three what I think are really important points. First, the one person in that room who really mattered, the man whose daughter had been really exploited by a modelling agency, had to sit there silently at the back while a regulation he really cared about was put through with scant scrutiny by members of Parliament who knew next to nothing about the regulation in front of them. And so the manner in which we did it must have seemed to him nonsensical, possibly even offensive, bearing in mind what he'd been through, what his daughter had been through. And I doubt that MPs or Parliament went up in his estimation. I thought it was a sad reflection on parliamentary democracy at work. The second reason that I tell this story is to emphasise that what I'm going to say this afternoon is not partisan, and I think we've seen that already. MPs of all parties have, of course, had experiences like mine in these delegated legislation committees. MPs of all parties experience and are dissatisfied with the way the scrutiny system works. As you heard during the first panel discussion, and governments of all political stripes have a poor record where scrutiny of delegated legislation is concerned. I have to say, as a rule, I think ministers like power, but not scrutiny. You know, this is a contest between the state and the people, and it's arbitrated very often by Parliament, but I don't wish to digress too much. Perhaps you'll ask me about it. The third reason I tell the story is because seemingly mundane regulations like that go through Parliament week in, week out. They don't attract publicity like the Brexit or COVID statutory instruments. They go under the radar of media and public attention, but they really do affect people's lives. That's why this issue matters so much and why this review is so important. Democratic control of political power, I think infamously can be seen to be why I came into politics. I'm not in Parliament because I want more power. I'm in Parliament because I think we must exercise care and caution about to whom we give power, how they use it, and crucially, how we stop them. How we stop them exercising power. And this is, I think, the crux of the problem that we face. Enormous power is wielded by ministers. Successive parliaments have, for decades, granted ministers extraordinary powers in hundreds of acts of Parliament that intrude into almost every area of our lives, as we'll see extremely dramatically recently. But the scrutiny procedures to hold ministers to account for the wielding of these powers are utterly inadequate. Indeed, they're so poor that I would say they shame Parliament. They provide for little accountability in any meaningful sense of the word. The volume of statutory instruments, coupled with the inadequately scrutiny process, leaves ministerial power subject to very little effective parliamentary control. So I don't say this lightly, but if we continue to allow the exercise of power by ministers on this scale, with so little accountability and no serious scrutiny, then we are knowingly and willingly accepting what I would call a form of elective dictatorship by ministerial diktat. Now, the pandemic has brought concerns about delegated legislation and parliamentary accountability into sharp relief. Never before have statutory instruments attracted so much attention. With a stroke of his pen, the Health Secretary was able to lock us down at home in a kind of house arrest for weeks on end in the most sweeping infringement of our liberties ever in our history. And he could do it because of a power, delegated power, contained in an act passed aptly in 1984. Now, I'm not today addressing the merits of the actions taken to protect public health. What concerns me is that Parliament was and is reduced to a bystander, a mere rubber stamp on really important law. Now, Hansard Society data shows that over 500 coronavirus-rated regulations have now been laid before Parliament. Some SIs made relatively innocuous changes, others were draconian, shutting down businesses, imposing hotel quarantine, or mandatory testing. People rightly had concerns about the nature of the powers in the Coronavirus Act, some of which did strip away our civil liberties, but the problem really is with the Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984. That's where the biggest problems lie, and it still is a sword of Damocles hanging over all of our heads. According to the Hansard Society's data, powers in the Coronavirus Act have been used just 26 times. In contrast, the urgent power in the 1984 Public Health Act, which enables regulations to come into force before parliamentary approval, has been used an astonishing 91 times. 91 times using the power in just this one act, a minister brought into force regulations with serious implications for all our lives, and by simply declaring that he thought the situation was urgent, he could legally wait for up to 28 days before coming to Parliament to seek the consent of the people's democratically elected representatives for those extreme measures. Scrutiny was a farce. Even the most experienced MPs, I could name some of them, could not work out what they were debating and what was actually in force at the period when they were debating instruments. Such was the overlap in the course of repeated amendment. But then the scrutiny process is a farce, dressed up occasionally by a bit of parliamentary theatre, even in normal times. It is just that prior to the pandemic, barely anyone noticed, other than us, parliamentary anoraks, people like me in the Hansard Society, possibly Mark and some of you here. The media, of course, are never going to be interested, with possible exception of Mark here, Darcy at the back of the room, are never going to be interested in the scrutiny of the latest set of local audit regulations, VAT provisions, or tribunal procedure rules. And who can blame them? The Fourth Estate can't really be expected to go out there and engage with an aspect of Parliament's work that MPs themselves find difficult to understand and routinely, I'm sorry to say, fail to take seriously. Who wants to be the journalist who must explain delegated legislation in 90 seconds on the evening news for the layperson in the street? But if they did cover it on the evening news, the man and woman in the street might find it hard to understand why it is that MPs who know something about a policy area have almost no chance of being appointed to a delegated legislation committee scrutinising a relevant instrument. Now, in my experience, I'm sorry to say, knowledge and enthusiasm for this task are usually treated as dangerous things by the party whips. So too, of course, is asking questions. Since my baptism into these matters in 2010, my approach, because I remember that man still to this day, my approach to these committees is always to read the papers, always to question the minister, and always to express my views. And inevitably now, I am very, very rarely appointed to a delegated legislation committee. Why? Well, because the whips, and God bless them, don't want MPs to act as legislators and scrutineers. I think it's worth saying that again, and it's almost an absurd point of view. There I am, going every time to these committees seeking to do my job, and as a result, they don't want me there. This is an extraordinary and absurd position for our democracy and our legislature. And it pains me to say it, but too many of my parliamentary colleagues are content that it's like this. So I've seen MPs having a grand time, literally a grand time, chuckling about just how fast they can get something passed into law. If you've read this excellent Devil is in the Detail report by the Hansard Society, you'll know that one committee in the 13-14 session lasted just 22 seconds. Just 22 seconds. Now that is going to take some beating, and I hope actually it's never beaten. On the other hand, of course, we all know that these debates are dead ends. They're dead ends, so perhaps the joke is on me and others for taking them more seriously than many of our colleagues. We vote on the motion that we have considered the statutory instrument. There's practically no prospect of securing a change to the instrument if you have concerns about how it will work. Earlier, in fact, Mark was very good in setting out how he secured some changes, and it was very hard work, involved both public and private campaigning at some considerable cost to him in time and exposure. They are not amendable, and this is crucial. They are not amendable instruments. It's very rare that a minister will withdraw the SI because in the committee it became clear there was a problem. At least SIs subject to the affirmative scrutiny procedure, though, get a debate. If an MP wants a debate on a negative SI, they have to pray against it. That is in the form of a motion for an early day. Of course, a motion for an early day is itself a form of satire on the public. I won't have anything to do with what is known as parliamentary graffiti, with one exception where it's rather politically forced. But I do think they're a satire on the public and should be themselves reformed. But this very idea of praying against a negative SI using a motion for an early day is an absurdity, and I think it's an insult to the governed. In the last session, 800 negative SIs were laid before Parliament. 800 of these instruments you can't debate practically. But according to the Hansard Society's data, just eight of them were debated by MPs. And of these 8, time for debate for 5 of them was found only after the expiry of the 40-day statutory scrutiny period prescribed in the Statutory Instruments Act 1946. Now, demand for debates is not high. MPs know the chance of getting a debate is so slim, few bother to request one. I've certainly never done it. The government controls the allocation of time in the House, and it decides if and when a prayer motion to annul an instrument will be debated. Unless the opposition is engaged, hope is forlorn. Now, this really matters because it is about the accountability of executive power to Parliament and to the people. The 40-day scrutiny period is set out in an Act of Parliament as the way that MPs should hold ministers to account for the exercise of those powers delegated to them that are subject to the negative scrutiny procedure. That's about three quarters of SIs laid in a session. But successive governments have frustrated the intention of the 46 Act by failing to schedule debates in a timely way, if at all. The point is this: the government that is subject to scrutiny gets to decide if and when that scrutiny will be undertaken. It is an indefensible situation. I've seen the delegated legislation system from both sides, of course, as a backbencher and as a minister. I had the honour of serving as a minister in the department for exiting the EU, and I know many of you here will have voted to remain, and I can only say I'm sorry. To those of you who were with me, you're welcome. I shepherded the EU Withdrawal Act through Parliament, and I signed, as you've heard, the first ever Brexit SI. So I know that there are some of you here who are government lawyers and legislative drafters, and I want to say again, as I did when I was a minister, thank you very much. The sheer scale and quality and rate of work done by government drafters was absolutely extraordinary, and without them, the law would have been in a dreadful mess. I think the scale of the task, I will admit, was far larger, I think, than anyone could have foreseen. So thank you for all that you did. Anything that I'm saying here is no criticism whatsoever of you. Now, many of you will recall the drama and the defining controversy of that EU Withdrawal Act. How should we handle those statutory instruments to rectify deficiencies in retained EU law? Part of the answer was the Sifting Committee, whose remit was to consider all SIs subject to the negative scrutiny procedure and decide whether they should go up to affirmative with 90 minutes of debate. The government accepted every single one of the upgrade recommendations, and I'm hoping Angela might tell us a bit more about that, having been on the committee. I'm not going to pretend it was a perfect solution, but it satisfied the House, and I think it was deliverable. Lord Frost has said he's going to have a review of retained EU law, and which I very much welcome. I do think that if we don't change law as we leave the EU, we have wasted an opportunity. But I have to say, parliamentary accountability must be at the heart of the process. I didn't campaign and give up, frankly, 15 years of my life to get to where we are today so that we could have ministers exercise power without parliamentary control and accountability. So we cannot have ministers exercising power by fiat with little oversight. I want to be really clear, though. I do think that delegated legislation is often necessary. There's no way Parliament could scrutinise primary legislation for everything done by a highly interventionist contemporary state. If anybody wants to read a book on this, there's an excellent chapter in the famous book, The Road to Serfdom. Once you have selected a highly interventionist political economy, of course the scale of legislation spirals out of control, but that is for another day. The system, of course, though, is far from where it should be with meaningful parliamentary scrutiny and decision. The review, the Hansard Society's review, will look at the full range of problems, and I'm very pleased and proud to be part of that review. I'm going to race through a few thoughts, possibly abridging them. First, we need to think about what goes into primary and secondary legislation. We've already heard about this, but I'll give you one example. Can it possibly be right that a criminal offence to which a prison sentence of up to 10 years is attached can be introduced via SI and therefore subject to so little oversight? Shouldn't that be a matter for primary legislation only? And yet it happened. The cost of net zero is my latest campaign, as some of you will know. In 2019, and I was there, the House of Commons approved, without a division, the Climate Change Act 2008 (2050) Target Amendment Order 2019, after that 90-minute debate. It authorised the decision to go from an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases to 100%. But I would put it to you that this change was an absolutely huge policy decision with considerable implications for everyone. The costs are estimated to run into trillions of pounds. 90 minutes of debate, no division. It was not appropriate for this to be dealt with by regulation rather than the bill. But even if you disagree with me and you think it was, you surely cannot defend just 90 minutes of scrutiny when the chief scientist recently wrote in The Guardian, quote, "Transformation is required at every level of society." Quote, net zero implies, I put it to you, a revolution, but it was nodded through after 90 minutes. So today we need to think about where the balance lies between primary and delegated legislation and what scrutiny procedures we can properly deploy to match the sheer scale of the decisions being taken. And the scale is vast, as we've seen, whether it's the suppression of our liberties tantamount to house arrest or the massive transformation of our society at all levels to meet net zero. We can't have a take it or leave it process anymore. And Mark and I were party to an attempt to change the curfew. We knew that some of the poorest in our society on minimum wage in restaurants would be disadvantaged if restaurants could only get one cover through their restaurants with a 10 p.m. curfew. how wonderful it would have been to either move the curfew to 11 p.m. or change to introduce last orders, say last orders at 9 or 9:30. But we couldn't do it. What's worse, we had to vote against the entire package of measures, rather alarming the people who'd so designed that package to try and dissuade us. But we could have improved the legislation if only we'd been able to amend it. I do want to say, though, that we can't have mechanisms which rest only in the hands of the opposition. There is sometimes, if I may say so, a thing as the conspiracy of the front benches. And Mark's already explained about the usual channels. We must have mechanisms whereby backbenchers can force scrutiny. So this take it or leave it approach, I believe, tramples the legitimate concerns of MPs on behalf of affected electors, and it's not acceptable. We also need to think about tertiary legislation, directions, notices and guidance, which we've heard something about. Ministers can and do exercise enormous power. I certainly called them out for allowing the confusion, rather, between guidance and law. And that power is often through regulators. Particularly now we've left the European Union, we have to ask what scrutiny tertiary legislation should be subject to. Now, as a starter for 10, and I admit that I'm only a humble aerospace and software engineer, I might argue that a suitable test would be, if a rule is justiciable before the courts, then it must be subject to parliamentary scrutiny and decision. Now, that would put an enormous additional burden on Parliament. We need to think very carefully, therefore, about the extent of the law and the procedures that we use. Now, as I say, I was an engineer by trade, and I want, therefore, good quality ideas practically applied. But in the Commons, very often, as we've heard earlier, members are not well equipped for that detailed technical scrutiny. We need much better impact assessments in order to assess how an instrument will work in practice. The Lords, of course, has the benefit of the work of the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee. MPs don't even have that. Now, some people will hear this or hear about this and say, including some of my MP colleagues, does any of this really matter? What difference will it make? The systems work like this for decades. The parliamentary procedures for scrutiny of delegated legislation, particularly in the Commons, have barely changed in years. Most people don't know about them and fewer care. I do not agree. I think constituents do care. They may not express it in exactly the ways that we all might, but every day my constituents in Wickham fill up my inbox in common with every other MP's, with concerns and complaints about issues affecting them, whether it's benefits, immigration, housing, the environment or transport. They often want a change in the law, and very often that change will be delivered through delegated instruments, through delegated regulations, through statutory instruments. I think our constituents expect their elected representatives to take that legislative process seriously and to play their part in helping to improve the legal changes that will affect their lives. I think the public also care about the accountability of power. My goodness, haven't we seen that recently? They care about the rules, and recently, in particular, the restrictions that affect their family and friends, their businesses and their livelihoods, and they care about who makes those rules, why they make them, and whether they're going to be effective. If they have concerns about the rules, the public want to know that I, as their democratically elected representative, am going to do something about it. They want to know how I'm going to stand up and question those in power and hold them to account for their decisions. I'm glad to do it, but on delegated legislation, it's awfully difficult. All of this is why this issue matters and matters so much. It's why I'm very pleased to commit to supporting this review. The Society has a long and distinguished record on this area and raising concerns well before it became of very pressing interest to everyone through Brexit and COVID. Now, I expect I won't agree with every recommendation that you make, but I'm pleased to work with you and other parliamentarians from across the political spectrum. We're going to need to galvanise political and media attention to focus people in on why this matters, in the hope that we can make some progress in the direction of reform to strengthen our system of parliamentary democracy. My lords, ladies and gentlemen, what is at stake here ultimately is nothing less than democratic control of political power on a mass scale. This really surely must matter.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve, for that tour de force. I'm really struck through a rule of law lens about how many of the concerns you articulate are fundamentally rule of law in their nature.
Yes.
And so many people, I think, don't think about the relationship between Parliament and the executive in rule of law terms. But of course, one of the principles of the rule of law is that Parliament must be supreme over the executive. Excessive delegation of lawmaking powers to the executive is contrary to rule of law principles. My colleagues, Katie and Ronan, sitting here, have been tracking all the coronavirus legislation as it's been going through Parliament. And in a series of reports, they've articulated many of the concerns which you've just set out so clearly. So I think it's really striking how there is this consensus emerging about the nature of, it's exposing the limits of the scrutiny processes in Parliament.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve.
You're very welcome.
I'd now like to move to our first respondents, Dame Angela Eagle, also very experienced parliamentarian, MP for Wallasey since 1992. A minister in a number of departments, so also extremely experienced with SIs in practice, and also shadow leader of the House for a period of time. And if I could just say personally, in relation to the last of those, in addition to your many other achievements, while I was working in Parliament, you made the business statement on a Thursday really fun to actually read. So I'd like to thank you personally for that. So, Angela, if you'd like to respond to Steve, please.
Well, thanks, Murray. I put a lot of work into making my business statement fun to read, because I think you can make a lot of points, political points, in an amusing way, as well as always being po-faced. So I hope I'll be able to do a bit of that here. Firstly, I've been struck thinking about this by how ever-present the general view, not only in the Hansard Society, but around the whole place, has always been, while I've been a Member of Parliament, that the delegated legislation structures aren't fit for purpose. They've never really been considered fit for purpose. They've always been considered as a kind of practical thing that governments had to do because Parliament simply didn't have enough time to look in detail at the statutory instruments as they were developed. And Steve and I think the panel before have gone into great detail about why that is. I don't demur from any of that. But I think I've seen over my 30 years in Parliament actually a dynamic which has changed. It's possible to say the process hasn't changed that much since the 1930s, but I think the attitude of government ministers, succeeding governments, those who draft legislation, actually has changed. And I think it's changed for the worse in terms of producing Christmas tree bills that hang all sorts of things that barely connect together on. And you can't actually do a lot of scrutiny because you're switching from one big issue to another, and you know all the statutory instruments that come with those bills are going to be many and varied. Of producing framework bills, I mean, that just wasn't a phrase that I came across at all when I first came into the House nearly 30 years ago, because it wasn't done. There were certain standards and unwritten rules about what would be acceptable and what wouldn't be acceptable to the House. And they have been driven through with a coach and horses during the time that I've spent in Parliament. I would say by both governments, but I think particularly in this century, it's got very much worse. Obviously, coronavirus and Brexit are two examples that are very front-end loaded in terms of statutory instruments. And the problem is that it's very convenient for government to decide later the detail that they're going to put in the framework bill. It's very convenient for drafters who are under enormous pressure to push the workload a bit further down and know that it won't actually cause that much trouble in Parliament if you've got a big majority, because you can push it through and you can argue for it, and it might be a bit of a worry, but it really won't make much difference. And I also have to say that, and this is a reform that was made when we were in government, the timetabling of primary legislation in committee has been a disaster for scrutiny in the House of Commons, of a sort that I thought would never come about when that rule was changed. It's essentially shoved most scrutiny of most primary legislation to the House of Lords, who have more time and more inclination to do it. And the other issue I think that we've all got to think about, when I first came into the House, it wasn't quite ticker tape, but it was CFAX. We didn't have television, we didn't have 24-hour news. We weren't expected to be on the Today programme at 5 in the morning and on Newsnight at 11 o'clock at night and get into our beds at 1 in the morning. We weren't under the kind of pressure as legislators that we've subsequently been under. We didn't have the same levels of expectation with email and our ever-expanding email boxes in the constituency. We didn't have the sheer weight of work in the constituency that we all take for granted now. We didn't have the chance to be on Loose Women or Have I Got News for You or any of those other things that, you know, occasionally people will, not least our current Prime Minister, will stray into doing. And it's pretty bloody boring to sit on an SI committee if you could be on a Have I Got News for You, or you've got a big issue going on with sewage in your constituency, or a big closure of a factory, or whatever's going on there. Yes, I did do the sifting committee, and there are some interesting issues to talk about when we come to looking at the review about how the sifting committee worked. I felt like I'd been sent to Alcatraz. You know, the chief whip sort of got me in and he said, look, we know that you're good at this sort of stuff, and we really need someone who can make sure that they don't get away with letting anything through in a negative committee, and we know that you will do the job, so can you go on it? And I'm saying, well, you know, what is my reward for being sent to that kind of hell? Because nobody covered it. We spent hours looking at gazillions of statutory instruments to check whether the government were pulling a fast one.
And they were.
And they were. In quite a lot of situations they were, and every single one we sent back to say should be made a positive, an affirmative resolution rather than a negative. The government had to accept it. They would have been in serious trouble if they hadn't. So the process itself was good, but it wasn't exactly very edifying or interesting for those of us that did it. And I got zero credit out of the House of Commons. It wasn't covered breathlessly on the front page of the Times. You know, I didn't get a load of opportunities to talk about it, or I don't think a single member of the public who I represent in Wallasey wrote to me about it. So it was a hell of a lot of work for absolutely no reward except knowing in heaven that you've held the government to account. Well, so I think we have to think about, you know, MPs who are trying to navigate their way through a very difficult life in stressful circumstances. Are they going to go for something that's enjoyable, or are they going to go for some grind? How can you actually reward them for going for the grind? And by the way, that job on the sifting committee would have been impossible if we hadn't have had very good legal counsel who did a lot of the work, the legal work, so they could present us with summaries and recommendations. We didn't always follow their recommendations, but we could then apply our own political nous to the subject and then make a decision about what, for example, the public out there might care about if they found out about it. And that is the value that we added. But it would have been impossible to do that job without having the resources that we had, and we could have done with a lot more. We Sir Patrick, who was the chair of that committee, developed quite a good line in important sort of disapproving letters to cabinet ministers, telling them about what a mess their departments were in when it came to drafting these statutory instruments, especially as some departments were pretty bad at drafting them and had to send them back to us several times because they were amending their own amendments to amendments of the statutory instruments. And again, there's no excuse for doing a shoddy job and hoping that somehow it'll be picked up later. I know these things are complex, and too complex, possibly, but there's an issue there. I think if you look at the way that statutory instruments fit into the legislative process and the scrutiny process itself, you can't just take them out of context. They are connected to what decisions are taken about what kind of primary legislation you'll have. And if you want it for convenience, if you want to fix it all later when it's in the House of Lords, you're not going to end up with decent scrutiny in the Commons, and you're not going to end up with well-written, decent legislation. And all too often, increasingly, that is the decision that's taken. Impact assessments you have to have. There's absolutely no way, if you want any kind of scrutiny, that you can try and look at some of these complex areas and be told the impact assessment will be available when it's in the House of Lords and long gone from where you are. That just shows a contempt for Parliament. And some of this is ministers who aren't on top of their civil servants in the way in which they're drafting the legislation. If you sit on the parliamentary draftsman and say, I want regular meetings, I want you in here explaining what you've drafted and when. I do not want you to go away in summer on a 3-month holiday and come back and look at it again a day before it's going to be introduced in the House of Commons. I want you here sorting it out until it's in a fit state to introduce. So there's a lot more work that could be done at all ends to make this more viable. I think scrutiny in general in Parliament is increasingly difficult. We have old and ridiculous ways of scrutinising financial legislation. We have old and ridiculous, unusable ways of scrutinising the estimates and parliamentary expenditure. We have an old antediluvian system that needs to be updated. So I'm looking forward to the work that's done here, but I want to just leave you with this thought, really. In the past, when I first came into Parliament, the governments of that day would not have behaved like the governments of this day behave. They wouldn't have prorogued Parliament illegally. They wouldn't even have thought about doing it. They would have been more restrained in the way in which they dealt with Parliament in the case of having emergency health legislation, which was passed, as Steve very well said, very quickly without due scrutiny because of the situation we were in. Governments, when I first came into the House, would not have, I'm going to use a technical term now, taken the piss about that. They would have realised that Parliament had given them leeway, they would have respected that leeway, and they would not have abused it. I think we've had a situation where that kind of restraint has gone. I don't know how you get it back. If ministers and governments don't show that kind of restraint in a country where we've got an unwritten constitution, we could be on a very slippery slope. And you cannot change that by changing the way that statutory instruments are made up. It's a cultural thing. And so we've got to think about that as well, or what we come up with simply will not work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Angela. I don't remember that unparliamentary phrase in business statement, I must say.
No, I wouldn't have used it.
I was particularly pleased, actually, as a former parliamentary legal advisor, to hear you mention in the context of capacity and resource the importance of legal advice as well as policy advice, because I do think that is also an important part of the picture here, that parliamentarians need to be facilitated to do their job properly, their scrutiny job properly, with the benefit of robust, independent legal advice that they can rely upon. And that's something which I think also needs working on within Parliament. So we're getting quite short of time, so I'm going to move straight to our second respondent, the Right Honourable Lord Judge, Igor Judge, who again is well known to you all. A crossbench peer for a long time, since 2008, now convener of the crossbenchers. Also, of course, former Lord Chief Justice and head of the judiciary in England and Wales. a distinguished visiting professor at King's College, and also another former Bingham Centre annual lecturer, who gave a very interesting lecture in 2017, I think, on a judge's view of the rule of law. And you won't be surprised to hear that delegated legislation featured very large indeed in that lecture. Lord Judge.
Very good.
Thank you. I didn't know quite where I'd start, but perhaps if I may go back to Mr. Harper saying quietly, and I'm not sure you would all have picked it up, not because he was trying to be quiet, but because it happened to be a quiet voice at the time, about the powers that are buried away in Acts of Parliament. That seems to me to be the main issue which arises in relation to delegated legislation. And I'll give you a for instance, and then I'm going to say it really is up to the Commons to stop enacting provisions which enable legislation to be produced by regulation, save in interesting things, but the height of pavement, where the traffic lights should they be red, white and blue, green, red and yellow, that's all statutory instrument stuff. But in 2015, in 2006, the Labour government passed a piece of legislation in relation to tax credits, and they gave the minister wide regulation-making powers. And in 2014 or 15, Mr. Osborne, a Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer, using that statutory power, introduced a power in the then government to reduce benefits by £4.5 billion. Of course, it's not what the Labour Party had intended. They intended to have some flexibility so as to raise the funds as and when they had the money, and it was thought appropriate. When you pass legislation that has a long-term line, you've got to remember who's going to be in power 5 years from now, 10, 15, 20. And we're in the very happy position in this country that wheels turn, political wheels turn, and the Conservatives come to power. There's a time for Labour, occasionally a hiccup of a coalition, but round the wheel goes. But that's not automatic. Democracy can work in strange ways. And why I so strongly support this review is that what we're actually looking at is parliamentary control of the executive, and in particular, because this is where power lies, the House of Lords has none in reality, the Commons control of the executive, the elected representatives controlling the power of the executive. And it was Murray who made the points I'm going to. If we really are talking rule of law issues, can we then please bear in mind that what is going on if the executive is controlling the parliamentary process is ruled by law? It's all perfectly lawful, all perfectly legal. It's all perfectly consistent with constitutional principle that it's for Parliament to decide everything. It's not necessarily rule of law. And when we're thinking about these issues, those two wonderful English words, very short two-letter words, contain a huge difference of impact. So let me just make a couple of points. It's not a party political issue. It's not a COVID Brexit issue, though that's thrown it all into light, and we've heard Mr. Baker speaking about the COVID issue. This has been going on for years. There were 10,000 or plus more pages of statutory instrument legislation in 2009. 10,000, and they're tiny print, you know. They're not as big as this. They're not as big as this. So it's not a new issue. I think we've also got to face the fact that it's an issue which is consequent on the huge burdens that Parliament takes on, the Commons take on. Let's remember the Member of Parliament has her legislative responsibilities, but they also have his enormous constituency responsibilities. Where do they get the time to marry up what each of their constituents wants, which is his or her problem addressed? And they come for all sorts of issues, many of which should be sorted out within the constituency itself by others, with the time they have available for examining legislation. And then we have this other, it's a Leviathan issue. Thomas Hobbes, haven't read the Leviathan for a very long time. But the issue of when government thinks it's doing more, it wants more powers. I mean, I saw a question in the House of Lords today about what's the government going to do about the fact that 2 trains had that collision in Salisbury. Well, now, if the government has to do that, it's going to say, well, if we're going to do that sort of thing, we've got to have the power to do it. So trust us with it. I want to go, if I may, just back to before all the other discussions you've had, to the making, to the granting of the government of these powers. Look at this. 300 pages. Police Crime Sentencing Court Bill. I have to remind myself. It contains 177 clauses, 20 schedules. It amends 39 statutory provisions. It has 62 delegated legislation powers granted to the Secretary of State. Of those, only 24 are subject to affirmative resolution. Don't forget the granddaddy of them all. There was lovely Henry VIII clause. You all know what I mean by Henry VIII clauses, don't you? But can I remind you that we call them Henry VIII clause and we forget that the Parliament that passed them in 1539 had the guts to say to that Tudor monster, but you can't change any of the existing and good laws of this country, and in particular, nothing that we in this Parliament have passed. Henry VIII was stood up to, and I think we have to stand up to him rather more. But there are also 4 guidance provisions, including amendments to PACE, which is the system which governs the relationship between the citizen, the police, the arresting officer, and so on. And then we have wonderful tertiary legislation. We have the Secretary of State having power by regulation to make provision in connection with the dissemination of a strategy. Under this section, that's power, duty to collaborate and plan to prevent, reduce serious violence. We have, what else do we have? We have this combination of things going on. Delegated legislation is taken for granted. And as a result, there's a Henry VIII clause in every bill. It must be in the computer of every department. Press the button for that one, just in case we need to amend it. There's protocols. They're beginning to become rather important. There are directives. They're becoming important. There's public notice. Do you remember that provision in the New Trade Act? That the law would be, you just announce it, stick it up on a board. It's like medieval England. The king has said you mustn't shoot his deer, and there it is. You've got strategy documents. You've got tertiary legislation, and one of the problems with COVID was that tertiary legislation was being used, which is the College of Police were given authority to issue guidance. It never had the form of law. Indeed, I don't think at the moment, though I'm obviously open to correction, that the College of Police actually exists as a statutory body with statutory powers. It's guidance that it gives. So where are we going? The urgent need for this review is that we've already lost the battle on delegated legislation. We must fight back about it, but we must not allow ourselves to drift into protocols, directives, public notices, strategy documents, guidance, and tertiary legislation becoming the way in which we make law in this country. I would love to go on for hours, but that's enough from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Igor. We are now getting, Ruth, we are okay to go past 6:30, so if you're all happy to stay, then please do.
I'm just conscious that members may have to leave to go and vote.
We're fine so far.
Yeah.
They're just about to start winding up, so we should be okay.
There are votes on the budget coming up.
The CST is going to try and take it close to 7, so we'll be all right for another 15 minutes probably.
Okay, excellent. So we've got 15 minutes. So if we can then hand over then to questions from the floor. If we could take, as before, 3 questions. We have a roving mic. There's one at the back. And if everybody who asks a question could first, for the record, just identify themselves and their institution, that would be helpful. Is it this mic?
Angela needs it because her lapel mic's not working.
Sorry.
Angela needs that one. Her lapel mic. I'm sure people can throw their voices in here.
Yes, Ronan.
Ronan Cormican, the Bingham Centre. 3 quick questions, if I may. First of all, it's all wheat and no chaff, because every single provision in an SI does something concrete with the law, so I don't know if I necessarily agree with that point. The second is a more direct question. why don't parliamentarians vote down SIs? And the third related question, if Parliament isn't doing such a good job, would you be happier for a more interventionist judiciary who would strike down SIs? And if so, there's some provisions in the Judicial Review Bill which restrict the power of the courts to take effective action against SIs. The
panel are bursting to answer. Yeah. Do we have any other questions? I did say 3 questions. I didn't anticipate they'd all come from one questioner. So since there's 3 questions rolled up, let's go straight to the panel. So, Angela, would you like to start?
Well, the government members who go on statutory instrument committees are there.
I think he's asking you to use the mic for the recording. Yes. Sorry.
The government members who sit on SIs would get into deep trouble with the whips if they started voting them down. And since all committees are constituted as a percentage of the result of the general election, unless there are mavericks who are willing to behave in unexpected ways, in which case they never get on an SI again, I think you've heard of that, then these SIs go through. And that is the nature of having a parliament with an executive that has a majority, even when there are not majorities in the House. The committees were put together as if there was during the period of, and in a way that I thought was unacceptable, by the way, but the government forced through in the 2017 Parliament a percentage of people sat on committees that acted as if they had a majority, even though they didn't. So even when we had no majority, the government still enabled itself to get its business.
Thank you. I'd just pick up on a couple of things, because Lord Judge made the point about the Commons needing to stop enacting provisions, and Angela made the point about culture more broadly, to your point, sir. The really big problem here is the state is a very proud spirit, and it treats amendments and rebellions as affronts to its dignity. And I really think that's got to change in the modern age. I've organised 1 or 2 rebellions, as you might have noticed, including when Mark Harper was Chief Whip. Mark, sorry.
I did as well.
Yeah. But, you know, it's a hell of a thing to overturn a majority of 80. I think Mark and I have had the opportunity, we could have done it if Labour wanted to do it with us. But this idea of kind of, in a sense, governing in rebellion with the Labour Party is a horrific thing to do. I mean, look how we tested our constitution nearly to destruction. So the answer to all of this is, it is a culture change from the very, very top. I mean, does anybody today, by the way, really believe we're governed by the Cabinet? So, I mean, I would like the Cabinet to govern, and I would like everybody to respect everybody else within the system, which seems a far-fetched dream. If we could achieve those things and start giving people the honour and the dignity they deserve within our system in order to govern people in a civilised way, then we might start having amendments go through, which meant we stopped enacting the provisions and started to satisfy both you and Angela on culture.
In relation to the culture issue, can we bear in mind that the Commons hasn't struck down a piece of a regulation since 1979? So you're actually shifting rather more than a wall. When the House of Lords did it in 2015 in relation to the tax credits, there was a huge investigation because the Prime Minister thought this was a total denial of the democratic system, and we were outdoing our constitutional power. On the question in relation to judicial review, for heaven's sake, it's for Parliament to make the law. Judges decide whether whoever is exercising powers given by the law is acting lawfully or not. That's a sensible way of deciding whether the law has been obeyed or not. But the idea that judges should start law-making because we don't think the Commons has looked at this closely enough. One of the things I used to be very careful about doing is not looking to see how we got the rubbish we sometimes had to look at actually onto the statute book. You had to look at what the law was, not what you wanted it to be. And so I think the issue is very simple. If there's legislation which says judges may no longer say that something is lawful or unlawful, and done by statutory instrument, and done because the Minister of Justice thought so, then I hope there would be a rebellion in the House of Commons. I hope so.
We may soon find out. Jeff.
Thank you very much. My name is Jeff Bingham, Professor of Law at UCL, and was previously a legal advisor to the House of Lords Constitution Committee. And I wanted to ask the panelists about an impression I've had that the to and fro during legislative scrutiny of bills over whether power should have affirmative or negative scrutiny is a species of theater, because I wonder, at the end of the day, the measures sail through affirmative scrutiny just as much as they fare just as well under affirmative scrutiny. So, but you know, the nefarious part of that is that the government looks like it's giving concessions to the Delegated Powers Committee or the Constitution Committee by saying, yes, we'll give you affirmative scrutiny over those powers. So I wonder if that piece of theater is not constructive for the democratic process relating to these instruments. The second question is whether it would ever be feasible to have a standing select committee that would be elected along the lines that the right reforms created, elected by the House, rather than ad hoc delegated legislation committees that are controlled by the whips. These committees would be more independent, but unfortunately, such a standing committee would need to deal with such a massive number of SIs. I wonder whether it would go from Alcatraz all the way to hell.
I think such a committee would make the sifting committee look like a holiday on a Caribbean island. So that's the first thing. I don't think you'd find anyone who really wanted to be in exile in such a place for any length of time. And it's not the way our Parliament has traditionally done things. So you'd have to have a complete change, I think, in the way that all legislation is looked at. The right reforms achieved the opposite of what he thought they should achieve. And so I think you've got to be very careful of the law of unintended consequences. Yes, they were only half put into effect, but it wasn't until the right committee reforms were introduced that we got to the stage where government decided it could completely ignore votes in the House of Commons. On the floor of the House of Commons, on Thursdays, it routinely ignores the will of the House as expressed, because it says, oh, it's not really a government motion, so we can ignore it. I mean, when we were in government and we lost the vote on whether the Gurkhas should be allowed to come to Britain, we put it into effect. It never occurred to us that we should say, oh, well, it wasn't a real vote, so we're just going to ignore it. But since 2017, or 2010, 15, the right reformers have actually weakened the voice of Parliament as expressed in votes in the House of Commons, the exact opposite of what he was trying to do.
Yeah, if I may, Murray.
Steve,
So yeah, I absolutely agree with you. It's largely theatre. What I would say is, notwithstanding what's actually happened, at least with an affirmative, you have got a chance to vote something down. And, you know, Mark and I have organised some opportunities where we might have dealt with that curfew issue, although we would have had to vote down the whole package. So there is a lot of theatre, but I would say it's not 100% theatre. But you remind me of the old adage that if you wish to maintain your respect for sausages and laws, don't look how they're made. I think one of the problems we face today is that it's very much easier for people to look and see how they're made. So, for example, the renewal of the Coronavirus Act, people could see us, for example, not dividing the House, and there was great laughter because only Desmond Swain was shouting no. And, you know, every profession's got its in-jokes, and it was most unfortunate. We were laughing at the absurdity of Desmond Swain screaming his head off, knowing the Speaker wouldn't take it for a division. But that wasn't fair on the public. They just saw MPs laughing, and they were confused. People who've trolled me were confusing the Coronavirus Act and the Public Health Act and thought we were laughing at them as we carried over draconian powers to lock them down at home. Wholly undesirable that all of that should have happened, and a product of the way that our law is made. So I would say yes, but elective dictatorship was a phrase I used because it has come up. You'll know better than me. It's come up in the past. Because of the party whipping system, once you've got a big majority, notwithstanding the efforts of people like me, it is awfully difficult to overturn the government's business. Combine that with the pride that the state has in trusting itself with power and trusting itself to get things right. Well,
my own view is that it's lovely if the result of the Constitution Committee of the Laws or the Delegated Legislation or the Secondary Legislation Committee that the Minister says, well, we'll give you an affirmative resolution. Personally, I think that's window dressing. And the fact that Commons hasn't turned one down since 1979, and when we did, it was a constitutional disaster, according to the government of the day, suggests that. I do think it is completely daft that we have a system in which, if I look at a statutory instrument with 100 provisions in it, and I'm very happy with 99, I think they all advance the sensible society's sensible progress, but I think one needs amending slightly so as to change a power one way or another. I either have to go for that one and win, which is a different point, but if I did win, the 99 that I thought were perfectly sensible approaches to a problem would all be lost. I cannot understand that. And it must stem from perhaps earlier days when it was thought that statutory instruments would not include quite such dramatic things as modern ones do, including creating criminal offences, imposing imprisonment on the basis of criminal offences created by secondary legislation. Maybe in those ancient days before we were all born, it wasn't quite the problem that it is, but I really do think that not being able to amend a piece of statutory instrument is completely daft.
Any more questions from the floor? No, in that case, Ruth, can I hand over to you to close proceedings? Thank you all from me as chair to the panel for a really fascinating discussion, and over to Ruth.
Great, thank you, Murray. And just to echo, thanks to the Society, to all our speakers, really appreciate it, and particularly to Steve and Angela, who've agreed to serve on the advisory group. We promise we are well aware of all the time pressures that you're under, so we will use your time carefully. But thank you for all that you've done to support this initiative, and to Mark as well, and the other members who spoke earlier. Thank you to all of you for coming. It has been a real pleasure to look out on people and to be able to have this kind of discussion. Obviously, we've got a lot of food for thought out of today's event. I hope it helps prompt thoughts on your part as well about these issues. As Tom said earlier, we'd love to hear from you if you have particular ideas, particular questions, particular things we should be looking at. Keep an eye on our website and Twitter, where we'll be obviously putting further information out in due course. But I'm quite sure that we will be in touch with all of you at some point, inviting you to future events, seeking your help and assistance with some of the development of our ideas through this review. So thank you once again for coming, and for those of you who are able to, we've got some drinks next door if you'd like to continue the conversation informally. And if for those of you who are leaving and have to get off, safe trip home. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you.